So the EU withdrawal bill passed its second reading in the House of Lords this week, but what could we expect in the future stages? Joining me is Lord Strathclyde and Lord Foulkes. And let's start perhaps with what we can't ignore this week in terms of Brexit, which is the leaked report. The headline being Britain is going to be worse off no matter what scenario we go for. Lord Strathclyde, perhaps we can start with you. How damaging do you think this is potentially for the government, bearing in mind that they said we can't release this report because it will undermine our negotiating position, but now the report is being published to MPs. It seems to be a bit of a disjointed approach from the government towards what's going to happen.
I don't think it's the least bit damaging. It was an incomplete leaked report, as the government made plain. We'll have to wait and see until we've got the finished document to take a view about what it does in terms of our negotiations, about what it does about the different choices that face us. But I'm entirely in favour of the government being very open about these kinds of reports, so that we all know not only the direction that we're going in, but ultimately where this journey is going to take us and the kind of Britain that we're going to have outside the EU, but still trading and still defending and still being involved with our friends in Europe.
It's been rather forced, though, the government's position on actually publishing this report. I mean, it's been very resistant to do so. I mean, was it a mistake for the government not to just publish, make it known, the vulnerabilities, the position of where we're going to go?
No government likes a leak. No government operates through leaks, so you've always got to be careful about that. And in particular, we don't like partial leaks where there are reports that are incomplete. So much better now, the government has said they're going to publish something, and let them publish it, and then we can take a view when we've seen it.
And do you suspect that when the full report in its entirety comes out, it won't be as bad as perhaps what the headlines have been saying?
I wouldn't dream of speculating, but I suspect that the people who leaked the original one had a purpose in so doing, so they tried to make it look worse than it actually will be. That would be my view. But it is
and that's
simply
from a civil servant or civil service.
Whoever leaked it. I mean, you probably have a greater view about who leaked it than I could possibly do. And none of we can all speculate about what is all this. In the end, it's not very helpful, this kind of speculation. What really counts is the negotiation that's taking place in Brussels between the Commission, between the British negotiators. Let them get on with the job. This sort of daily view, who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out, who's done well, who hasn't, is completely unhelpful to everybody.
Of course, Lord Foulkes, you might have a different view as to how this report has reflected on the government's stance and the way they're approaching Brexit in the terms of accountability and democracy and clarity for particularly Houses of Commons, Houses of Lords, at the time we're going through this big legislative process.
I can see why the government didn't want it published, because it's a devastating report. It shows the kind of Britain that we will be if Brexit goes ahead is a poorer Britain.
Notice you use if there rather
yes,
than
because
when.
I'm still not sure that it's guaranteed to go ahead. It's likely to go ahead, but there's still a possibility that it could be derailed one way or another, either by the Conservative government imploding or by some other means. But
by the House of Lords?
But on this report, this devastating report shows that any option is at the very least, 5% less growth than we would have if we remained part of the European Union. And now we've had reports from the CBI, from the TUC, from others, forecasting this, saying we'll be worse off outside the European Union. But this is the first time we've had a report from within, from the department of exiting the European Union, from the very department that's doing the work, saying we're going to be worse off.
What do you say then to, as has been the government line, and indeed some ministers' line, regarding where this leak has come from and the motives behind this leak? As this is a civil service troubled with the concept of delivering Brexit, trying to sabotage it.
Well, it may well be, and Tom Strathclyde might be right. It might have been leaked to warn people of the dangers of Brexit by civil servants or by a civil servant. But that means that the people who are involved, the civil servants who are involved in negotiating our exit, realise that it's going to be a disaster. And what worries me is that we've got lots and lots of people, as we saw in the two-day debate in the House of Lords, saying, this is going to be terrible, going through all the reasons that Brexit is going to be difficult. The universities, the industry, the arts, everyone expressing concern. But
Not everyone, in terms of there are some people who do see it far more optimistic.
But then they say, but we're still going ahead with it. We're going ahead with it because of this advisory referendum. They're, as I said in the debate, they're like lemmings. In fact, they make lemmings look cautious, the way they're running towards a cliff edge, because they know it's a cliff edge. They know it's going to be a disaster.
Before we move on to actually talking about what has happened in the past couple of days, Lord Strathclyde, I must ask you about Theresa May. The papers, I mean, let's take the Spectator's front page this week, you know, lead or go. You've served under several Conservative Party leaders and indeed Prime Ministers as well. Where do you see Theresa May standing in the Conservative Party at the moment? Is this just journalists doing menace, causing a bit of chatter, or is there a serious possibility that Theresa May is very vulnerable at the top?
Look, we're going through a nationally very confusing period politically. This whole Brexit thing, which bears over everything.
Surely which demands strong leadership.
Is a serious. Well, even if she was the very strongest leader possible, there would still be this issue bubbling away. And there are different forces wanting different things, pushing her, the government, even the opposition in different ways. I don't think there's a fundamental problem here. There is not going to be a general election until 2022. The maths is very straightforward and very simple. So she's got plenty of time to complete the Brexit process and then take a view about the nature of Britain in the future.
But the question was, does she have plenty of time, in the sense of, is the party behind her, are even signed her? Is there now a serious effort from within to actually, to be honest, feel that the party would be better suited with someone at the top who, reports are to be, you know, taken accurately, is struggling with the concept of leading the party?
The only reason Mrs May is leader of the Conservative Party is because MPs, Conservative MPs, want that to be the case. And for so long as that remains, she will remain as leader and Prime Minister.
With your full support?
Very much so.
Let's have a look then at the EU withdrawal bill. 2 days of debate, record-breaking 190 peers spoke. It's passed through the second reading, unopposed. Now on to committee stage and obviously the stages beyond that. For you, Lord Foulkes, what is the main, from listening to everyone yesterday, apart from the concept of the referendum being binding or not, where's the government going to find real trouble in terms of what the Lords are going to send back, potentially add on in terms of amendments? Where's the real sticking points you can identify?
Can I say, first of all, in relation to Theresa May, it doesn't matter who's driving the car in Brexit, towards Brexit, it's the destination is unknown. We don't know what kind of outcome the Conservative Party and the government want, whether they want to be part of the of the European Free Trade Area, or whether they want some kind of different way forward. Because one part of the cabinet say one thing, and the other part say the other. Which isn't
dissimilar from the Labour Party position, which is constructive ambiguity as well.
I think the Labour Party needs to be more precise and more definite in our policy. And I'm urging Jeremy Corbyn to take a lead and to be more pro-European and to be more anti-Brexit. And I would hope he would do that, because the majority of Labour supporters are in favour of staying within the European Union.
Well, let's just park the Labour situation for the moment and just look at the withdrawal bill.
Yes.
In the terms of the process it's going through right now, what are the key sticking points for you?
Clause 11 is a very important one. Clause 11 deals with the devolved administrations, Scotland, Wales, and hopefully Northern Ireland coming back as an elected parliament. And what happens is that all the areas of responsibility that are coming back from Europe, which are the responsibility of, and ought to be the responsibility of, the devolved parliaments, at the moment in the bill are being held in Westminster. And there have been discussions over months to try and find some solution to make sure they're devolved. And they haven't come up with it. They were supposed to move amendments in the Commons and they weren't able to. We need them in the Lords as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we are going to have a constitutional crisis between Westminster and the devolved administrations. I've just tabled an amendment which says we shouldn't pass the bill through the House of Lords unless we have the approval of the devolved assemblies and parliaments.
There has been some speculation, perhaps, that this issue regarding Clause 11, that the failure to come up with a resolution regarding the powers, particularly to the devolved assemblies, could potentially, in terms of Scotland, obviously where you've represented, could fuel a argument for, well, look Westminster taking all the powers back from Europe. Why don't we make another push for Indie referendum too? Do you see that as realistic, or is that again an SNP perhaps?
No, I think that's a grave danger. The one thing that Tom and I do agree on, Lord Strathclyde and I agree on, is to keep the United Kingdom united. We're against the Scottish National Party. We're against breaking up the United Kingdom. And I fear, unless we get an agreement on the devolved areas coming back from Brussels, it will fuel the fires of nationalism, and we'll see a rise again in the SNP. In fact, it's already started in the latest opinion poll.
Lord Strathclyde, what do you make of the Clause 11? Where's the resolution going to be found here? Is the government going to have to give some way as to giving devolved assemblies more of these powers back from the EU when March 2019 comes about?
Well, as you rightly pointed out, both George and I were part of this extraordinary two-day debate, nearly 200 speakers, more hours than we could possibly count, but at the end of which the government minister in his reply said a very interesting thing. He said, this is not a perfect bill. We accept there need to be some changes. And in my speech, and I'm sure in yours as well, you urged the government to work constructively and responsibly with people from all sides of the House. Because the key thing about this Brexit, it's not a difference between the parties, it's differences within the parties. So we have to operate on a cross-party basis and to try and find the solutions to some of these small issues. And
where
and
do you see the solution in terms of the Clause 11 and the devolution?
It's very interesting, because I think that George is suffering from some tortured logic here, because he is in favour of a European single market with powers controlled by Brussels.
Not controlled.
But as soon as we move out of the EU, he says these have to come back to Scotland and not remain in the single market of the United Kingdom with these powers at Westminster. But there's also another part of this. We're at the very first steps of this 50-year saga of being part of the EU. So the principle of devolution is completely well established. And over time, more and more powers, as has been the case over the last 20 years, more and more powers will be devolved.
But these complications indicate why it's so perverse, so unwise of the government to be pursuing Brexit. Not just in relation to the devolved parliaments, but Northern Ireland, the prospects of a hard border between North and South Ireland, or if we are not part of the customs union and the Republic is, of the kind of border that we'll have
coming in across the sea. Yeah.
I mean, we're going to have smuggling at a huge scale across the border. It would be, and then we've got Gibraltar, we've got all the other overseas territories, problem after problem. We'd have been much better staying in the European Union.
But I hope we still will. With all those problems and challenges, that was a question put to the British people, and of course it was voted to leave anyway. So the argument would be, well, it might be difficult, but it's what people
that's
want.
why I challenge the referendum. Because unlike the Scottish referendum, the 16 and 17-year-olds didn't have the vote. European Union citizens didn't have the vote. They're the people who are most affected by Brexit. And at the end of the day, it was an advisory referendum. In our constitution, we don't have binding referenda. And the government saying this is an instruction to us from the British people, that's entirely wrong.
George can't be entirely allowed to get away with this. Yes, you can argue about the merits of the referendum, but the result was utterly clear. However, since the referendum, we had the vote on Article 50, which triggered the Brexit process within Parliament, which was passed in the House of Commons, with an overwhelming cross-party majority. We then had a general election where the Labour Party and the Conservative Party both said we're going to provide for Brexit, and finally we've got to the end of an extremely gruelling process in the House of Commons where amendments were made and amendments were promised. So we've been through a democratic process. Our job in the House of Lords is to revise and scrutinise, but it's not to block.
But in a democracy, we have the opportunity of changing our minds. We do it at every election. We kick out one government, bring in another government. And now we know the reality of Brexit. It's an opportunity.
Speculative reality, of course. Everything is speculative.
I think
15-year economic speculation
we
is
see
pretty
what's
speculative.
coming. Yes, but we see all the other problems. It's not just this latest report about the economics. It's the border in Northern Ireland, it's Gibraltar, it's the worries of the universities. There are so many concerns being expressed.
Let's just sort of move on to where the House of Lords is. How effective, I suppose, for people watching in, it might be, how effective is the House of Lords actually going to be as the machine of holding the Commons to account over the withdrawal bill? And Lord Strathclyde, you were, of course, a government chief whip in the House of Lords for several years. In terms of controlling Conservative peers, because as you've mentioned, the arguments are going on within parties as much as between parties, how effective do you think the government are going to be able to control the voting of the Conservative MPs to ensure that certain amendments, perhaps, or certain caveats are not are included?
Well, there's an interesting paradox here. My view has always been, be interesting if George agrees with this, is that the House of Lords has always been a more Europhile house, always been more pro the House of Lords. So this whole debate is quite challenging for the collective psychology of the House of Lords. But in passing the second reading last night, that was the House of Lords saying, fine, we accept the basic principle. We may not agree with every part of it, but we accept the basic principle. As far as the government is concerned, if I were them, I would worry about some aspects of this bill, which is why I would start discussing. Lord Hope of Craighead, who's the leader or convener of the crossbenchers, a very distinguished Scottish judge, made some extremely valid points. And he wasn't the only one. I mean, you know, almost every other speech were from very serious people, exactly the kind of people that the country would want and need in a second chamber, made very good and valid points about this. And the government will want to work with them to decide what is fundamental to the legislation and what is less fundamental but would improve it and make it work better.
But do you see it as necessary for the government to really have to take the Lords' opinions in, because they're not going to be able to control their Conservative peers, at least, in the way that they will be able to control their MPs?
Well, a moment ago we had a discussion about the Labour Party. I mean, there was a big signal to me in the last 2 days from the official Labour Party that they were not going to die in a ditch on any part of this. They accept the principle. They will support most of it. They've got one or two details in it. And it's the Labour Party who will decide whether or not the government is defeated. It won't be Conservative peers or crossbench peers, or dare I say even Liberal Democrat peers. It will be a decision by the Labour Party. And for so long as the Labour Party, perhaps grudgingly, go along with it, then the government will get the bill that they want.
Suitable times to be. The government, do you see it as the Labour Party? You know, they're not going to die in a ditch, and they are going to go along with the principle of the withdrawal bill passing.
I think our front bench think that it's a necessary evil. They don't like it, but they think it's necessary if Brexit is going to.
Will you follow your front
ahead.
bench through?
On most things, I will certainly, but there are one or two. I'm in favour of looking at another referendum once we know the terms, for example.
Do you think that's going to be a particularly difficult or perhaps successful amendment tagged on to the withdrawal bill?
I think it may be. I think we've got enough people
in the Labour Party,
in the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, across benches, and indeed some Conservatives who are in favour of it's not a second referendum, it's a new referendum, completely different from the previous one, because we'll know the terms this time. And that is very, very important. Just
the shape of that question you would want on that referendum paper would be...
If Theresa May manages to get a deal, let's assume that, that's not for certain. If she manages to get a deal, then the British people could vote either in favour of the deal or the status quo. And that gives them the opportunity either of going ahead with Brexit on the basis of the deal or staying in the European Union.
Which is essentially an in-out referendum. Would you like to leave on the conditions set or stay in on the status quo?
Absolutely.
So it is a second referendum then?
Well, it's a third referendum because there was one in 1975, but it's on a new basis. It's not a speculative one. It's one where we know exactly what the option is of moving out of the European Union.
So let's just give the final thoughts then. Lord Strathclyde, you've said that the Lords should be careful in defeating the government is something the Lords should steer well clear of, and you've warned against gumming up the legislative works. How tricky do you think the Lords is going to be in the next months? Do you think it's just going to be a process which goes through the usual rough and tumble of politics but gets through, or do you think there's the weight of this bill is going to drag it through the hedges?
Well, it's hard to say just now. But we've had the sort of the opening shots in the second reading. There was some concerns there'd be votes last night. In the end, they did not take place. The government got its a second reading. But we're about to start that sort of parliamentary hand-to-hand fighting, trench warfare, which is difficult and complicated, and many complex arguments will be put forward. I think a lot will depend on the attitude that the government takes on dealing with some of these issues, resolving some of the minor details, the less important things. But it's got to stick to its fundamental view that this bill, which is a process bill, puts European law into British law, which is a prerequisite of Brexit, and then when it's in British law, after that, the British Parliament can decide what to do with it.
The reason there wasn't a vote last night was because Andrew Adonis, who moved the amendment, realised quite rightly that this is not the time to move for a second referendum. And
but there could be a time in the future.
Yes, and a lot of people said that. A lot of people advised him that this wasn't the time, but they would support a second referendum later, either at the committee stage or the report stage. But this bill is just the beginning. We're going to have another withdrawal and transition bill. We're going to have more and more bills. This whole process has a long way to go. And the interesting thing about the 2 days debate, there wasn't anyone who supported the bill in total. Not even the minister supported the bill, because it's a really dreadful bill in so many ways. The Henry VIII powers, giving powers to ministers instead of Parliament, the devolution aspect of it, so many other things. It's going to have a very difficult passage. I think there'll be a number of key amendments sent back to the House of Commons, and that'll be very challenging for the House of Commons to decide and for the government to decide.
The most severe of which likely to be this question of a second referendum, in your view?
I think so. I mean, I prefer Parliament to make these decisions, but since the decision to withdraw was made by this flawed referendum, I would want it to be overturned by a referendum with a better franchise and with a clearer indication of the options before the electorate.
I mean, an unflawed referendum, of course, for George is one that comes out with the result that he wants. And if the last referendum had said Remain, he wouldn't be arguing for a second referendum now. And nor would I. The logic behind this second referendum is absurd. The one thing that is most likely to guarantee the worst possible deal from our European partners is a decision that we're going to have a second referendum. You know, this is an issue that's been haunting us for many, many years. And the British people, I think, were in no doubt about the decision that they were making, for better or worse. That is decision. All the other things that I laid out earlier on have taken place. It's now time to get on with it.
Well, we'll be discussing, so I've no doubt, for the next weeks and months ahead. Lord Foulkes and Lord Strathclyde, thank you very much for coming on today.